And today, we're tackling a period that's, well, it's foundational, but also deeply disturbing.
Yeah, we're looking at what's called the Long 16th Century, roughly 1492 to 1607. The scholar Gerald Horne terms this the dawning of the apocalypse.
Which sounds dramatic, but when you look at what starts here, it's hard to argue. This is where we see the real institutional beginnings of mass chattel slavery, the ideology we call white supremacy, settler colonialism.
And the kind of global capitalism we're still grappling with today. It's often smoothed over, isn't it? Terms like exploration or early modernity.
Exactly. Those terms hide the violence, the catastrophe. They hide the mechanics of how this system was built.
So our goal here isn't just to list dates. We want to understand the how. How did England, this sort of peripheral island nation, eventually give rise to its revolting spawn, as Horne puts it, the U.S. after 1776?
Right. We need to look at the global picture. The intense rivalries, Spain, Portugal, the Ottomans, were major players. England was the underdog.
How did they maneuver? How did they come out on top by basically adopting this whole new and catastrophic way of operating?
It involved a fundamental shift.
Yeah.
For centuries, a big conflict axis was pan-European Christendom versus the Islamic world, the Crusades and all that.
Hmm.
But this period sees that morphing into something else, a project focused much more explicitly on conquest, on commerce, and crucially, on race,
So it stops being primarily about who you pray to.
and becomes about the color of your skin.
Yeah.
That shift from theological difference to epidermal division is really the engine of the new form of empire we see emerging, especially in the Atlantic.
And understanding that shift, that cynical, maybe even pragmatic construction of race for empire, that's vital if you're trying to grasp the roots of anti-colonial thought, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It reframes modernity not as some inevitable progress, but as a system engineered out of competition and, frankly, brutality.
Okay, so where do we start? To understand 1492 and what follows, you argue we actually need to look east first.
That's right. The immediate trigger, the geopolitical pressure behind Columbus's voyage wasn't just, a thirst for discovery. It was the Ottoman Empire.
Specifically, the fall of Constantinople in 1453.
Yes. The sources really hammer this home. It's called a hinge moment. The Ottoman Turks taking Constantinople, the heart of the old Byzantine Empire, sent shockwaves through Christian Europe.
So it wasn't just symbolic, it created real tangible pressure on Spain and Portugal.
Oh, absolutely. Intense pressure. The Ottomans were militarily powerful, economically dominant in the Eastern Mediterranean. They effectively controlled or threatened the traditional overland trade routes to Asia.
Which forced the Iberians, Madrid and Lisbon, to look elsewhere.
Exactly. They needed a countermove. The Atlantic voyages, including Columbus's, were framed almost as a strategic necessity, either find a back door to Asia's wealth or find new resources altogether to fund the ongoing fight against the Ottomans.
So the gold fever, the search for wealth in the Americas, was directly tied to funding this larger, centuries-old conflict with the Islamic world.
In large part, yes. It wasn't just exploration for its own sake. It was state-sponsored accumulation to fuel geopolitical and religious struggle. That changes the narrative quite a bit.
It does. And you're saying this necessity also provided the theological cover. It allowed the logic of the Crusades to just sort of bleed into colonization.
Precisely. There's a clear mechanism for this, documented in papal edicts from the time.
Let's unpack that. Pope Nicholas V, 1452, that edict seems absolutely pivotal. How did it work? How did it open the door?
Well, that edict essentially gave the green light. It sanctified Lisbon's practice of enslaving and selling heathens and foes of Christ. Now, at that specific moment, who were the primary foes of Christ from the European perspective?
Muslims.
Exactly, principally Muslims. So it provided a religious justification for enslaving people captured in what was seen as a religious war.
Okay, so the principle is established. Non-Christians, specifically enemies in a religious conflict, can be enslaved under church doctrine.
Right. But once that principle is out there, blessed by the Pope, well, it proved incredibly flexible. When Europeans encountered populations in West Africa or the Americas who weren't Christian, they just stretched that definition.
The foes of Christ category gets broadened opportunistically.
You could say that, and we see this happening early on, even within Spain itself, before the huge transatlantic slave trade really kicks off.
You mentioned Valencia in the 15th century.
Yes, there were documented efforts there by slaveholders to deliberately misclassify West Africans, people from Senegal, Gambia, as Moors.
Even though they weren't necessarily Muslim or from North Africa.
Right. It wasn't about accurate ethnography. It was a legal strategy. If they could label them as Moors, then they fit neatly into the existing theological justification for enslavement based on religious conflict.
So it's a preview, a foreshadowing of how race would eventually supersede religion as the primary justification.
It really is. You see the groundwork being laid. The justification starts theological, but the application quickly becomes racialized when convenient.
Okay, so Spain and Portugal have this theological justification. They have the pressure from the Ottomans pushing them west. They arrive in the Americas, and the wealth they find is, well, unprecedented.
Staggering. The sheer volume of gold and silver flowing back to Iberia, particularly Spain, fundamentally altered the European economy. And yes, it gave them resources to confront the Ottomans and other rivals on a scale they couldn't before.
And this influx leads to what we now call globalization. You pinpoint Manila in 1571.
Yeah, the founding of Manila is crucial. It becomes this key Spanish trading hub connecting the Americas directly with Asia. Silver mined in the Americas Potosi, places like that gets shipped across the Pacific.
To trade for what? Chinese goods.
Exactly. Silk, porcelain, tea. It creates this massive global circuit controlled by Spain, linking 3 continents. Silver from the Americas pays for goods from Asia, consumed in Europe and the colonies.
But that neat economic picture has a horrific human cost baked into it.
Absolutely horrific. The sources are chillingly clear. This entire global engine runs on the destruction of indigenous populations in the Americas.
Through disease, warfare, forced labor.
All of it. And as indigenous populations collapse, the system demands replacement labor. That's where the transatlantic slave trade explodes, bringing millions of enslaved Africans into this vortex of extraction.
The scale of that initial indigenous population collapse, it's almost unbelievable. The figures for the Aztec and Inca empires.
Between roughly 1520 and 1620, just one century estimates suggest they lost something like 90% of their populations.
90%, let that sink in.
It's demographic catastrophe on an unimaginable scale. And it wasn't just a short, sharp shock. It continued.
Like the Cerro Rico mines you mentioned.
Right, in modern-day Bolivia. A single silver mining complex. Sources estimate it consumed maybe 8 million lives over 3 centuries, starting in the 1500s. Mining accidents, mercury poisoning, starvation, sheer exhaustion. The wealth flowing to Spain was extracted directly from millions of bodies.
And this wasn't just confined to the big empires. Smaller groups, too, like the Caddo people.
Yes, in what's now the southeastern U.S. Estimated population around 200,000 before European contact. By the 18th century, maybe 1,400 remained. That pattern repeats across the hemisphere.
So for anyone studying anti-colonial history, it's crucial to remember this context. The English didn't arrive in a virgin land.
Not even close. They arrived on a continent already profoundly reshaped and, in many areas, depopulated by a century of Spanish and Portuguese violence and disease. Madrid's actions, in a grim sense, sort of prepped the ground.
Soften the territory for the next wave of colonization. Okay, so Spain has this huge head start, immense wealth, they've kicked off globalization. Why didn't they lock it down? Why did they leave the door open for England, the supposed underdog?
That really comes down to the inherent weaknesses baked into the Spanish colonial model itself. Their greatest strength, that intense unifying Catholic ideology, also became their biggest liability.
How so? You mentioned religious rigidity.
Well, compared to what England would later do, Spain's approach was incredibly sectarian. It created structural problems, especially with manpower and social control.
But didn't early Spanish law sometimes offer enslaved people certain rights, however minimal, that were absent later in English colonies?
Yes, that's true, especially in the very early days, drawing on older Mediterranean or even Roman legal traditions. There might be customary paths to manumission, or a slightly more recognized personhood, legally speaking. Still brutal, but structurally different.
So what was the main weakness then?
The chronic manpower shortage. Spain's commitment to Catholic purity, enforced by the Inquisition, meant they actively barred huge numbers of potential European settlers. If you weren't a proven devout Catholic, so no Protestants, no Jews, no new Christians suspected of secretly practicing Judaism, no Muslims or people of Moorish descent, you were generally excluded.
Which sounds completely counterproductive if you're trying to occupy and control vast territories. You need people, soldiers, farmers, administrators.
Precisely. They prioritized ideological purity over the practical needs of colonization. This self-imposed limitation created a severe ongoing shortage of loyal Spanish settlers, soldiers, and laborers, especially in dangerous frontier zones like Florida.
And that shortage had consequences, right? It gave other groups, particularly Africans, unexpected leverage.
Huge leverage, though incredibly dangerous. Africans were present very early. We know they were in Florida by 1526, certainly part of the founding of St. Augustine in 1565. Because Madrid was so short on reliable defenders against indigenous groups and European rivals like the French and English,
They were forced to arm some Africans.
they felt they had to. They ended up creating a population of free Africans, often former slaves who gained freedom, sometimes by escaping to the Spanish from English colonies, and were then armed and used as militia.
That sounds risky from the Spanish perspective.
They knew it was. The sources call it an endangering process. You're arming people you're also trying to keep subjugated or whose relatives you're subjugating. It created this constant simmering fear among the Spanish colonists.
You mentioned Pedro Menendez de Avila's warning Madrid about this, around 1565.
Yes, he was the founder of St. Augustine. He wrote back warning about the situation in the Caribbean islands, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico. He said there were 20 or 30 enslaved Africans for every one Christian Spaniard.
It's 20 or 30 to 1.
Yeah. And he added, chillingly, that this generation multiplies rapidly. His explicit nightmare scenario was that Spain's rivals, especially the French Huguenots, who were Protestant, would land, promise freedom to these enslaved masses.
And they'd immediately rise up and join the French against their Spanish master.
Exactly. The demographic time bomb ticking right at the heart of their empire, largely because they couldn't or wouldn't attract enough loyal European settlers due to their own religious tests.
So this internal weakness, this demographic imbalance, made them vulnerable not just to European rivals, but also to resistance from within, indigenous resistance, obviously, but also from Africans.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And particularly the Maroons, enslaved Africans who escaped and formed their own independent communities, often in remote defensible areas. These Maroon communities weren't just hiding, they were actively challenging Spanish authority.
The idea of Maroons as conquerors comes up here.
It does. They demonstrated the limits of Spanish power. We see evidence as early as 1526 in a failed Spanish attempt to settle what's now South Carolina, where African resistance and likely Maroon activity played a role. But the classic example of Maroons actively shaping geopolitics involves Sir Francis Drake.
Drake again, not just a pirate, but exploiting these internal Spanish weaknesses. Tell us about Panama in 1572.
Drake was brilliant at seeing the strategic opportunity. He knew about the established Maroon communities, the Cimarrones in the jungles of Panama. These were people who had fought for their freedom and fiercely hated the Spanish.
So Drake forms an alliance.
He does. He allies with the Cimarrones. They guide him through the terrain, provide intelligence, and fight alongside his men. Together, they ambush Spanish silver convoys crossing the isthmus. They raid Spanish settlements.
And the loot goes back to England.
A significant amount, yes. It deposits immense wealth into Queen Elizabeth's coffers and, just as importantly, demonstrates to all of Europe that Spain's control is fragile and that African resistance can be weaponized by Spain's enemies.
Okay, so Spain is struggling with internal contradictions. Religious rigidity leading to manpower shortages, leading to reliance on potentially rebellious African populations, leading to vulnerability exploited by figures like Drake. Meanwhile, England is watching.
Watching and learning. Learning what not to do and figuring out a different, more pragmatic, and ultimately more brutal path.
Which brings us squarely to England's strategy. They start as this underdog, right? An island nation, peripheral, riddled with debt, internal unrest.
Absolutely. London was in a precarious position. Think about things like Kett's Revolt in 1549, a massive peasant uprising, mainly about land enclosure. This terrified the English elites.
Land enclosure taking common lands and privatizing them.
Exactly. It created huge social disruption, displaced vast numbers of people from the land, filled the cities with the poor and unemployed. England had this internal crisis, this potentially explosive population of dispossessed people.
So how does that domestic problem connect to colonization?
It provides both the push and the pull. The elites needed to get rid of these masterless men, these dissidents and vagabonds. Exporting them to colonies seemed like a solution, a safety valve. For the poorest themselves, facing starvation or harsh laws at home.
Going to the Americas, even with the risks, might seem like the least bad option.
That's how it was framed by some. They become this pool of what you might call disposable colonizers.
Yeah.
Expendable bodies to secure land overseas.
And England was broke, constantly fighting wars, massive debts. The crown even seized monastery lands under Henry VIII, and it still wasn't enough.
Not nearly enough. The costs of warfare were astronomical. That French campaign in 1513-14 supposedly ate up 10 years of normal royal revenue. They were desperate for new sources of income.
Which leads to pragmatism overriding piety. This is where England really diverges from Spain.
Fundamentally, London proved willing to make alliances and adopt policies that would have been unthinkable for rigidly Catholic Spain. The goal was survival, profit, and power, not necessarily theological purity.
And the prime example is their willingness to deal with Spain's primary antagonists, the Ottoman Turks and the Moroccans.
Right. This is a stunning geopolitical move for the time. Protestant England making common cause, effectively, with major Islamic powers against Catholic Spain. It's purely realpolitik. The sources compare it to, Nixon going to China. Ideology takes a backseat to strategic advantage.
And this flexibility, this willingness to break from religious dogma, allows for the crucial ideological innovation England develops.
Yes, it allows them to move away from the Ottomans' more traditional, equal opportunity approach to enslavement, which was often based on religious difference or prisoner of war status, towards something new.
Something laser-focused on race.
Exactly. London, and later Washington, developed a system that relentlessly targeted Africans and, in a different but equally destructive way, indigenous peoples, for permanent, inheritable bondage or elimination. This is the core of the Whiteness Project.
Let's unpack that term, Whiteness Project. It wasn't about skin color initially, was it? It was about forging unity among Europeans.
Precisely. England's colonial model required vast amounts of land, which meant systematically dispossessing and removing indigenous people. This was job number one. To do that and to control the labor force needed to work that land, which increasingly meant enslaved Africans, they needed a reliable, unified bloc of European settlers.
But these settlers were English, Irish, Scots, Welsh, groups that had often been fighting each other back in Europe, sometimes bitterly.
Absolutely. So whiteness gets constructed as a tool, an ideology, to overcome those old world antagonisms. It creates a new, unified identity in opposition to the racialized other, the indigenous person being dispossessed, the African person being enslaved.
So it's a form of class management, almost. Give the poorest Irish or Scottish settler a sense of superiority and shared interest with the wealthy English planter based on their shared whiteness and their shared opposition to non-Europeans.
That's a core argument in the sources, yes. It's a way to build cross-class solidarity among Europeans, dulling potential class conflict within the settler population by uniting them against a common racial enemy. It simultaneously solves the problem of exporting dissidents and creates the manpower for conquest and exploitation.
And you see this difference clearly when you compare England to France in North America.
Yes, the contrast is instructive. France was often more focused on the fur trade, which required maintaining relationships, even alliances, with indigenous groups. They needed indigenous people alive for their economic model to work.
Whereas the English model, based on agriculture and settlement, needed the land itself.
Which meant indigenous people were primarily seen as an obstacle to be removed, displaced, or destroyed. The logic of the economic system drove the genocidal impulse. The Whiteness Project provided the ideological justification for that removal. It was built for demographic replacement.
Okay, so you have the ideological tool whiteness, you have the disposable workforce, but you still need capital. Startup money, where does that come from?
Piracy. Plain and simple. Or the slightly more polite term, privateering. State-sanctioned piracy.
This wasn't just a sideshow, it was central to England's finances.
Absolutely central. Figures like Drake weren't just rogue adventurers, they were operating with royal charters. They were essentially state-sponsored venture capitalists engaging in armed robbery on the high seas, primarily against Spanish shipping.
And the returns were enormous. Drake's 1577 voyage.
The figures cited are astronomical. An investment may be equivalent to £2 million, returning something like $2.5 billion in modern value. Enough, it was said, to pay off England's entire national debt at the time. So piracy wasn't just tolerated. It was a primary engine of capital accumulation for England. The sources note that between 1575 and 1630, investment in privateering actually exceeded investment in the famous East India Company.
So the initial funding for English colonization for this whole project built on whiteness and dispossession was largely financed by looting Spanish ships carrying wealth looted from the Americas and Africa.
It's a cycle built on extraction and violence from the very beginning. Cynical geopolitics, racial engineering, and institutionalized theft. That's the foundation being laid as we move towards the end of the 16th century.
Which sets the stage for the final push into North America, the boost phase, as the sources call it.
Exactly. And the key turning point that really enables this is 1588, the defeat of the Spanish Armada.
Spain's big gamble to crush England at the source fails spectacularly.
It does. It's a massive psychological blow to Spain and a huge boost for England. It doesn't end Spanish power overnight, but it signals a shift in naval dominance and clears the way, psychologically and militarily, for England to make a serious, sustained attempt at North American colonization.
And England benefits here from being the second mover. They learned from Spain's mistakes.
Definitely. Spain had already tried pushing north from Florida, tried establishing footholds, but they kept running into problems. Persistent indigenous resistance, the constant threat of African rebellion or escape, and crucially, those self-inflicted wounds from their religious purity tests limiting their settler base.
They just couldn't consolidate control effectively.
Right. They sort of paved the way, encountering the initial resistance, mapping some areas, but ultimately weakening their own ability to project power northward. England steps into that relative vacuum with a more pragmatic and ultimately more ruthless model.
Let's look at those Spanish efforts again, like Florida and New Mexico, as case studies of why their model faltered compared to what England was building. Florida first. St. Augustine, 1565.
Okay, St. Augustine. Strategic location. The Spanish plan explicitly calls for bringing in 500 enslaved Africans for labor. But the rules also strictly forbid any settlers who are Jewish or Muslim Moorish, again, limiting their manpower pool.
And English agents like Hawkins are already snooping around, right? Seeing the weaknesses.
They are. They're scouting the coast, trading sometimes, likely probing defenses. And Spain has this persistent problem of enslaved Africans escaping from English and French territories to Florida.
Why would they escape to the Spanish?
Because the Spanish, partly out of desperation for manpower and partly based on older laws about sanctuary for escaped slaves who converted to Catholicism, would sometimes grant them freedom. They become free laborers or, more often, soldiers in the defense of St. Augustine against the English.
So it's this incredibly complex, unstable situation.
Deeply unstable. It bolsters St. Augustine's defenses in one way, but also highlights the fluidity of alliances and the constant threat of rebellion and escape, undermining the whole slave system.
And New Mexico in the 1590s, that shows the religious problem even more starkly.
Yeah, the attempt to colonize New Mexico under Oñate is plagued by the Inquisition's influence. There's strong evidence, or at least strong suspicion at the time, that several key figures in the expedition were crypto-Jews, or New Christians people, forced to convert, but secretly maintaining their old faith.
So the very leaders of the colonization effort might be deemed heretics by their own side.
Exactly. It shows the absurdity and fragility of trying to build an empire while constantly policing the inner beliefs of your own colonists. If you need loyal soldiers and settlers above all else, judging them on piety is structurally weak. London discarded that model for the pragmatic unity of whiteness.
But one fear united both Spanish and English colonizers, didn't it? The fear of the people they were oppressing joining forces.
Absolutely. That was the nightmare scenario. There were explicit warnings and rules issued in New Spain. Do not allow the Negroes to hold any communication with the native Indians.
Why? What was the stated reason?
Because of the many difficulties that result from it. They knew that if indigenous people fighting against land theft ever made common cause with enslaved Africans fighting for freedom, the entire colonial enterprise could collapse.
So the Whiteness Project wasn't just about uniting Europeans, it was also fundamentally about dividing the oppressed, preventing that cross-racial alliance.
That was a critical function of it, yes. Driving a wedge between potential allies based on race was essential for maintaining control.
Okay, so we have the ideology, the finance from piracy, the lessons learned from Spain. What about the actual tools of conquest, the military aspect?
Crucial, the so-called military revolution, the increasing sophistication and proliferation of gunpowder weapons was absolutely key.
And these weren't developed specifically for colonization. They came out of European wars.
Right. The constant warfare within Europe, England versus Scotland, England versus France, Spain versus France, the religious wars drove rapid innovation in firearms, artillery, fortifications, military tactics. These were then deployed overseas with devastating effect against populations often lacking comparable weaponry.
And this created a feedback loop, especially with the gun trade and slavery.
A truly vicious cycle. The rise of industrial centers like Birmingham in England became heavily dependent on the arms trade, a major market.
Africa.
Selling weapons to fuel conflict.
Often selling defective or obsolete weapons, actually. Arms that might not pass muster in European armies were traded in Africa for immense value, gold, ivory, and especially human beings. This influx of guns fueled existing conflicts and created new ones, generating captives who were then sold into the transatlantic slave trade to labor in the Americas.
So English industry profits, African societies are destabilized, and the American colonies get their labor force. It all connects.
It's a deeply interconnected system of exploitation. Which brings us to Jamestown, 1607. The arrival of the English in Virginia. This is the boost phase, really, taking off. Who are these first settlers?
Well, they weren't pilgrims seeking religious freedom, not primarily. The leaders, the initial military contingent, were often hardened veterans. Men who had fought brutal campaigns against the Spanish, maybe against the Ottomans, or significantly, who had participated in the extremely violent English conquest and colonization of Ireland.
People like Sir Humphrey Gilbert, Drake. They cut their teeth on atrocities in Ireland first?
Yes, Ireland served as a laboratory for English colonial techniques, land confiscation, displacement of the native population, the use of terror tactics. The men who led the early Virginia ventures were often veterans of those Irish wars, already accustomed to viewing the native population as obstacles to be brutally removed.
And the rank-and-file settlers? The laborers?
Often, they were the disposable people we talked about earlier. Conscripted vagrants, people cleared out of overflowing prisons, the desperately poor. The model was often that investors put up the money, and these lower-class individuals were deployed as the expendable frontline workers and soldiers.
The high death rates in early Jamestown certainly bear that out.
Tragically, yes. It was a brutal calculus. Investors provided the capital, the poor provided the bodies.
And even though Virginia initially might have had rules against Catholic settling, the practical needs of the colony quickly pushed towards that broader pan-European whiteness project.
Absolutely. Whatever initial sectarian ideas existed, the sheer difficulty of survival and the need for enough bodies to fight indigenous people and control labor meant that pragmatic unity among Europeans became paramount. Whether you were English, Scottish, Irish, even German or Dutch eventually, your shared whiteness and your role in subduing Indians and enslaving Africans became the defining characteristic.
So by 1607, all the pieces are in place. The ideology, the finance, the military methods, the disposable workforce, the lessons learned from Spain's failures. The foundation for a permanent race-based settler colonial empire is set.
It is, built on piracy, fueled by the gun slave cycle, justified by the ideology of whiteness, and predicated on the ongoing destruction of indigenous societies and the perpetual enslavement of Africans. That's the apocalypse Horne describes dawning.
Okay, let's try and wrap this up. We've gone through a lot in this deep dive into the long 16th century. The core takeaway seems to be that the rise of England, and subsequently the U.S., wasn't some natural progression.
Not at all. It was the result of a very specific, calculated strategic shift, moving away from the kind of religious rigidity that hampered Spain.
Towards this incredibly pragmatic, adaptable, and ruthless model based on racializing people, creating whiteness as a tool for unity among Europeans.
Precisely in order to dispossess Native Americans and enslave Africans more effectively. It was a class collaboration project, really, built on race.
And funded, initially at least, by state-backed piracy, and fueled by geopolitical maneuvering, like those surprising alliances with the Ottomans. Spain's failure cleared the path.
Their model just couldn't sustain the level of manpower and control needed for the kind of totalizing settler colonialism England pursued. London learned, adapted, and deployed race as its core instrument.
And the long-term result. This combination of settler colonialism and white supremacy, it did two things, didn't it? It suppressed class conflict among the settlers.
By giving even the poorest European a stake in the racial hierarchy, yeah.
And it fundamentally shifted the main axis of society from religion to race as the organizing principle for power and exploitation.
That's the core transformation of this era. Race replaces religion as the primary engine of empire building in the Atlantic world.
So here's the final thought for you, the listener, based on this material. The sources argue that constructing whiteness, deliberately engineering this unity among diverse, often hostile European groups, was seen as a gigantic step toward building the Republic, meaning the future United States.
Right. It was seen as necessary to overcome those internal European divisions in order to effectively conquer and control non-Europeans.
So if the history shows us that whiteness wasn't some natural category, but was engineered as a pragmatic tool of empire, a tool specifically designed to facilitate land seizure and enslavement by uniting Europeans against others. How does knowing that cynical origin story change how you think about racial identity today?
How does it impact your view of race, racial categories, and the ongoing struggles against the legacies of colonialism, now understanding its roots as a calculated imperial strategy? That's the question these sources really push us to confront.